What's up, hockey fans? Welcome to the Wraparound, brought to you by the Hockey News and presented by Sticks.com. I am your host, Emma Lingan. I am joined today by Michael Augello and Kelsey Surmacz of the Hockey News, and we are coming at you on this first, full week of training camps around the league to bring you all the latest and greatest storylines from around the NHL in bite-sized portions. So before we do get into all of that, do want to remind you we are brought to you by our friends at Sticks.com. Why break the bank on sticks when you can get pro-level composite sticks without the pro price tag at Sticks.com? That's Stix.com. Head over now and gear up without the markup. All right. I'm sure lots of Sticks.com shipments heading to NHL practice facilities around the continent right now with all of the training camp goings on that are happening here around the league. So we've got lots to get into today, guys. I want to start actually out in Vancouver. So Thatcher Demko, he signed a contract extension with the Canucks. This week, he did an interview with Sportsnet's Dan Murphy, and he said that he views this contract extension as, quote, a chance to prove myself to the city. So this is a 3-year, $25.5 million deal that he signed. This is after last season when he played just 23 games. He was limited, of course, due to injuries, and then he ended up with a career worst .899 save percentage. So, Mike, do you think that Demko can return to form this season and prove his worth, or is that maybe asking a little too much after last year?
Well, if you look at what the Vancouver Canucks did in the last year, they don't believe it because they signed Kevin Lankinen to a long-term contract. Now, they did have the confidence to trade a young goaltender who I think is pretty good in Artemi Panarin to Pittsburgh. But they were under a situation where they were going to lose him on waivers if they tried to send him down. So they were either forced to, basically play him or trade him. A few years ago, Demko was in the level of Oettinger and Hellebuck. He would be the third goalie or one of the three goalies for Team USA for the Olympics. Nobody's talking about that any longer. Now it's Swayman or Dustin Wolf or, there's a few others. And the reason is it has been impossible for him to avoid injury. And I hope for his sake that he can carry forth and play 45 to 50 games. He was a great goaltender, but he's 29 years old. I was stunned at the amount that Vancouver paid him. $8.5 million for a guy who you're not really sure about is a little ridiculous.
Well, and Kevin Lankinen, who was signed to a league minimum deal for 1 year last season, ended up kind of becoming the guy there in Vancouver and really earning his extension, which you mentioned. So it will be interesting to see. I, too, was a little surprised by how much Vancouver gave Demko with that extension. But Kelsey, you cover the Penguins, obviously, the team that received Shilovs from Vancouver. So what do you think about this kind of faith that they're putting in Demko? Do you think that he can turn it around? And really, how important is it for him to turn it around if they do have Lankin in there?
I think the best teams in the league, and we've seen this with, most of the teams that have won the cup in recent years, is that there's a good tandem there. And I think for the Vancouver Canucks, this is something where they are kind of banking on him returning to form. And we've seen him, be that guy. He's capable of it. But those injury concerns are a big concern, to say the least. And I do agree that price tag is pretty steep, even if it's only for 3 years. I think in some sense, this is kind of a really big prove-it deal, but at the same time, the deal with Shilovs to Pittsburgh kind of shows that they kind of are banking on him. So I thought this was kind of an interesting situation. As Mike said, they didn't really have too much of a choice with Shilovs, but I do find it a little bit steep of a price to pay for a guy who there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding. So I'm definitely curious to see how that plays. by the Canucks in my Kevin Lankinen has proven he can be the guy too. Great season last year. He performs when it counts. So we'll see how that shakes out. But I kind of see this being a tandem situation, and I think Demko will be given a little bit of room to prove himself here.
Well, hey, I'll tell you, an $8.5 million prove it deal sounds fantastic to me. I would sign that in a heartbeat. So hopefully for his sake, that he can get back on track and see what he can do for the Canucks here. Kelsey, I want to stick with you now. I want to shift back over to Pittsburgh. So of course, one of the biggest storylines around the Penguins is, of course, we always hear about Sidney Crosby. Is he going to stay with the Penguins? But of course, beyond that, there's still Malkin and Letang. Are those guys going to stay with the Penguins as they pursue this rebuild here? So, of course, when training camp opened, Malkin was asked about his future with the Penguins. And of course, he spent his entire career there in Pittsburgh. He said, I hope to stay here with Sid and Letang. I want to be with the Penguins forever, for sure. I hope I play great, and I hope everything goes perfect, and I'm perfect myself too. I want to stay here for sure. So that's a very Evgeni Malkin quote, if I've ever heard one. But he also, of course, was asked about trade speculation, and he himself brought up the Brad Marchand situation with Boston and Florida. And that was another guy who had spent his entire career with one organization and was a captain there. And so he talked about that, and he said, well, that trade looks pretty good for Marchand, but he ended up winning the cup as a result of it. So he kind of talked about well, the trading me or me going somewhere else would really only make sense if it's somewhere where I can go and win the cup. And so that's kind of, I think it's reasonable to say, listen, I'm not really interested in going anywhere else unless I am all but guaranteed a Stanley Cup on the other side of it, especially in the twilight of my career. So with all of that being said, Kelsey, you're on the ground and you talk to these guys. Do you think it's more likely that Malkin remains a member of the Penguins for the entirety of this season, or do you think that he gets traded?
I think that's entirely up to Malkin. I think, just as in the case with the other two, with Crosby and Letang, I think the Penguins have made it pretty clear, and just in the place that they're in too. It's not like even if he has an outstanding season, it's not like they're going to get a 2026 first round pick in exchange for him at the deadline, unless somebody really, really is desperate. But yeah, I just don't see a situation where he moves unless he says he wants to move. This isn't going to be a situation where he's forced out the door to get some value in return. And to be honest, I think this is a situation he's going to stay. I don't think he's going anywhere unless, there is a team like Florida, one of those big contenders that comes knocking and says, we really want you here. I could see that. Malkin also said that, depending on what happens this season, he might play another year. His contract is up at the end of the year. We don't know what's going to happen with that. If he does have a great season, it could be one of those situations where he's dealt to a contender, returns to the Penguins on a one-year deal right after that. So there's a lot of what if about this situation. And Kyle Dubas has reiterated that they're going to revisit the situation with Malkin during the Olympic break, which I think is a fair thing to say for GM. I think they're kind of on the same page about that. So Malkin wants to stay here. I think the three of them have kind of made it clear that this is the place they want to stay. They want to see things through to the end. But it's hard to say no when a contender like that comes knocking. So just like Brad Marchand last season, I wouldn't completely discount the possibility, but I think Malkin's going to remain a Pittsburgh Penguin for the rest of his career, and we'll see what happens next year. But that's just my take on it. And you can't. I have one last thing too. Back when Sidney Crosby signed his contract extension, and back when Malkin and Letang signed their contract extensions a few off seasons ago in 2022, they were kind of, I don't want to say pushed by Crosby to sign those extensions, but there was a lot of word about, Sid being like, hey, let's do this together. So I can't underscore the value of that and the fact that they want to bring this team back to contention together and want to finish out their careers together here. So I don't see anything happening unless a big team comes around and offers him a deal he can't refuse, basically.
Unless Florida can somehow come up with even more cap space. I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but we will see. Mike, what's your take on this situation from outside the market? Do you think that Malkin stays in Pittsburgh this year and potentially beyond this year if he does decide to continue his career?
Well, as Kelsey said, I mean, it's completely up to him. He's got the no move clause, so if he doesn't want to go anywhere, he's a Russian Mitch Marner. He can do whatever he wants. But here's the situation. I do not think, even if he has a fantastic year, the Pittsburgh Penguins are going to sign him to another contract. This is the last year in Pittsburgh. They are fully, I think, in on the rebuild. Unless I'm just completely off the mark, I don't think they're going to be anywhere close to being a contender for a playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. And at a certain point at the Olympic break, if they're 15 points out of a playoff spot, then Kyle Dubas is going to go to him and say, okay, do you want to go to Los Angeles or do you want to go to Colorado or someplace to have a chance at one more Stanley Cup, or do you want to finish your career here? This year, because we're probably not going to sign you. And then it's up to him because, Boston, up until the time that they traded Brad Marchand, were trying to sign Brad Marchand. But then, they played hardball and he said, trade me to Florida. He went to Florida and he won a cup. These players are going to have the same sort of situation where, they're going to face, well, either I go someplace where I want to go or I'm going to finish out my year here and then it's it. So the choice is going to be up to him in the end.
Mike, I saw earlier this week that Austin Matthews was doing a media availability and someone asked him a question about Mitch Marner and he said something to the effect of, okay, you guys got 2 more weeks and then we're done with these Mitch Marner questions. And somewhere I was just thinking, you know what? He's probably talking to Mike.
Well,
talking to Mike when he said that.
He was talking about their pregame ritual of like both of them staying on the ice until the very end. And the reporter was asking him whether, somebody else is going to stay out there with him. And yeah, I'll just say, yeah, it's never going to happen, Mitch Marner. Sorry.
We're always going to hear about Mitch Marner, which is a good segue into the Toronto Maple Leafs. Let's talk about them. So they, of course, are going to be without Mitch Marner this year. They had made a couple of significant additions at the deadline last year in Scott Laughton from Philadelphia and then Brandon Carlo from Boston. So both of those guys had rather underwhelming performances at the end of the year based on the expectations that came with them. Now, Mike, now that those guys are going to be with the Leafs, from the start of the season, do you expect a better performance from those guys? I know you've talked about Laughton before as being a guy who you expect to see more from, but can you elaborate on that?
Well, Laughton was sold as their solution as a third line center, and he never was that. That was the thing. They ended up paying a third line center price in a first round pick and Nikita Gurbiankin, who was a pretty decent prospect. But I don't think he ever was a third line center. He's slotting in on the fourth line. I think he'll do fairly well there. Probably score 10, 11 goals. I disagree with the assertion that Brandon Carlo was underwhelming. What did people expect? Bobby Orr? He's a stay-at-home right shot defenseman, the type of right shot defenseman they have been looking for a decade for. And what did he do? He stabilized Morgan Riley, and that was a pretty good pairing for the last 10 to 15 games of the regular season and the 2 rounds in the playoffs. It wasn't Brandon Carlo's fault that they got beaten to a pulp by the Florida Panthers in the second round. So I expect him to be Brandon Carlo, a steady, physical right shot defenseman.
All right, Kelsey, what do you think? Do you think that we see these 2 guys level up for Toronto this year?
Well, I agree with Mike's assessment. I quite like how Brandon Carlo looked for the Leafs last season. I think he's going to be even better this season. I love that addition for them. And as he said, it's something that they needed badly on their right side. I do still think they could afford to maybe add to that right side a little bit at some point. But he was really solid with Riley last season. I think that's going to be a good pairing for them again this season. And as far as Laughton, I do still think there's, a little bit more upside there than he showed with them last season. I do think he was underwhelming after the trade deadline. He only had 4 points, 2 goals, 4 points after the trade deadline. And if you're a third line center and if you're counted on to be that third line center, that isn't going to fly as far as production. So I think they're going to look for him to show a little more than he did post deadline last season. But I kind of agree. I think he was playing a little bit, I don't want to say above his ability. I think on this team, he's probably a fourth line center, and that's where he's going to stay. So we'll see how that shapes out. But I think there's some opportunity for a little bit more upside from Laughton there. Because, he was a little bit of a pain for the Philadelphia Flyers. I think I'd like to see more of the Scott Laughton from the Philadelphia Flyers when he's this year for Toronto. So we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, the Leafs could definitely use that. I think that kind of sandpaper element that he brings or that he brought to Philadelphia. Mike, I want to ask about a player that you're very familiar with, a former Buffalo Sabre. That would be Victor Olofsson. So he could potentially push for a top 6 spot in Colorado this year. So he signed a 1-year deal with the Avs this summer. It's just a little over $1.5 million on his cap hit. He spent last season with Vegas. He had 15 goals, 29 points in 56 games, and he was primarily playing alongside another former Buffalo Sabre in Jack Eichel. So do you think, with your experience covering Olofsson, what you know about him, do you think that he could be one of maybe the more underrated signings of the offseason for Colorado?
It's very possible. What I referred to Olofsson when he was signed was Gabriel Landeskog insurance, because he's a scorer. He can play in the top 6. He scored 20 goals 3 times in his career. Last year, 15 goals in 56 games. That's a pretty good ratio. I know he got hurt at some point, but came back, and he played with Eichel in Buffalo, so that worked. I think that, he's a power play guy, so he could plug in on the second power play and maybe move up to the first power play. He's got a really good shot. Yeah, I think he could move into the top 6 if they have injuries. He was basically the replacement for Jonathan Drouin, and it's a very low-cost signing, so I think it was a good one.
Kelsey, what do you think about Olofsson with the Avs? This is a team that didn't do a whole lot in terms of adding free agents this offseason. So do you think this could end up being one of the more underrated moves of the offseason?
Yeah, I definitely think so. This is a solid depth addition for them. And, he has similar statistical profile to Kiviranta last year. So I think this is going to be a good signing for them. I think he can provide some of that depth that I don't want to say they've been lacking because they've had it, but he kind of provides a little bit more of a scoring touch for them down the left side. So it'll be nice to see, him kind of where he fits into the lineup. It'll be interesting to see, where he slots in relation to Kiviranta and some of these other guys that they have. I think this is a solid signing for them, and I think he's gonna make a difference in that lineup.
All right. Well, obviously, with the start of training camp has been the start of lots of Olympic talk, lots of Olympic coverage, with hockey being back in the Olympics in 2026. So, of course, we've talked a little bit about this on the show before, but Drew Doughty with the LA Kings, he was asked this week about potentially being selected for Team Canada. Obviously, very deep pool of talent in Canada, but he was asked about the possibility of being selected. He said, quote, "I know it's going to be hard for me to make it, but personally, I expect to be on that team." So now this is a guy, of course, who managed to still play for Team Canada in the Four Nations face-off despite having a broken ankle. He had just come back from his injury and said, "I want to play for Canada." So I think that shows how badly he wants this. But I mean, Mike, do you think he'll be on the roster for the Olympics, or do you think it's how much of an uphill battle is this for him?
He's going to have to perform to a reasonable level like Drew Doughty has in the past. If he does that, I think he's a lock. I mean, you have to factor in, Alex Pietrangelo is no longer in the picture. If he was healthy, he would be on this roster. The Olympic roster is 25 players, not 23. So they'll probably carry 14 forwards, 9 defensemen, and 3 goalies. Maybe 8 defensemen. But even if it's 8, I think he's going to get selected because they always like to have a veteran guy, and he has played in every Olympics that the NHL has gone to since 2010 in Vancouver. So, I mean, you cannot beat that experience. And, I just think unless there's a significant drop off in his play, Drew Doughty is a lock for Team Canada.
Kelsey, what do you think?
I agree that the experience factor is a big thing here, and the fact that, as long as he kind of maintains his production, he should be a lock, because Team Canada does tend to value that experience and that veteran leadership, and that's something that's pretty invaluable to this team. But, I mean, there's a lot of competition on that right side, and I think it also depends on how much of a mistake or not mistake they thought it was to leave off Evan Bouchard. So we'll see, there's solid competition. You already have Makar, you have Pareka, you have Sanheim. There are going to be other guys in the mix here, and that probably should make the roster as well. But I do think he has a leg up because of that experience. And as like Mike said, as long as he keeps up his production and is able to maintain that, I don't see a way he doesn't make it. But we'll see. I'm interested to see with the Bouchard situation with this and if they kind of give him a look this time around.
Sweden and the U.S. are praying that Evan Bouchard is there to have his 3 giveaways a game.
Offensive defenseman, very offensive. Yes. Well, one player who will not be at the Olympics because he is Russian is Artemi Panarin. So this is another guy who has spent a large part of his career with the New York Rangers. He, of course, has declined to answer questions about signing a potential extension with the Rangers, saying he's trying to focus on hockey, trying to do his best. We hear that a lot around the league from any guys that are approaching the window for a contract extension. So Panarin, he'll turn 34 in October. He had 89 points in 80 games last year. I mean, 34 isn't maybe as old as it once was, but I think that he is getting older. So, Mike, do you think that he potentially moves on from the Rangers to actually pursue a Stanley Cup? Or do you think, what do you think the Rangers should be willing to pay him to keep him there?
Well, that's the question here. And again, he has the no movement clause, so he's under complete control. He scored 89 points last year. If there's not a significant drop off, I'm sure the Rangers would love to bring him back. But this is the 2026 free agent class. This is Kaprizov. This is McDavid. That's going to be a big factor. If those guys are out there, I think they say, okay, we have a better, younger version of Panarin. We have to pay more. But he's 34. I mean, you would think if he wants to stay with the Rangers that he would be willing to take a little bit less to stay there. But I think he wants to hit the jackpot one more time. And I don't think he's going to hit the jackpot on Broadway again.
Yeah, Kelsey, what do you think? Do you think that we actually see him stick with the Rangers, especially considering, the Rangers have had a bit of a mass exodus here over the last couple of years, and their front office situation seems maybe questionable at best. So what do you think about Panarin's future with the Rangers?
I think that depends a lot on what the Rangers do this season. I don't think this is a team that's, going to be trying to lose in any sense of the word. They're going to be trying to improve on last season. If they find themselves in the playoff picture, I could see them, trying to keep him there. But to Mike's point, there's just younger talent in the league. This is an aging roster, and they're kind of at a point where even if they make the playoffs this season, even if they push for the playoffs next season, that window is kind of slowly closing on them. So I don't think they can make the mistake of committing too many years and too many dollars to a player who's 34 years old when this team is probably in decline as it is. Again, this is one of those situations too. It's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out with the cap going up next season, because this is a really just interesting situation for NHL GMs. It's kind of uncharted territory for them because we're going to see probably some overpayments on contracts. And is that something that the Rangers are willing to do to keep Panarin in the fold there? So it's tough because it's not like you can just replace Artemi Panarin. They don't have that replacement for him. It's not going to be easy to get that replacement for him. But those are all things that they're going to have to consider come deadline time and just seeing where this team is at in the playoff hunt come deadline time. Because if they're out of it, I think he's gone for sure. If they're in it, it's going to make things quite interesting because we'll see, how much they want to commit to a 34-year-old aging winger with this team kind of on the decline already.
Well, obviously Rangers are a team trying to get back into that playoff hunt, as you mentioned, after a very disappointing 2024-25 season. One team that actually kind of surprised a lot of people by making it into the playoffs this past season was the Ottawa Senators. And so I say surprising because there was a lot of factors working against this Senators team, including the fact that they scored the second fewest even strength goals last season among all teams in the league. And looking ahead to this year, I mean, you assume that they want to build on the push that they made last year and go deeper into the playoffs. But that being said, they really didn't do much to add any offense over the summer. They only added Lars Eller, so really didn't make a huge push there to kind of correct their goal scoring problem from last season. So Mike, in your opinion, looking at this roster for Ottawa, which offensive player do you think needs to step up the most for the Sens this year?
Well, overall, I think they want their big players to score. Like Brady Tkachuk, he scored 29 last year. They want him to get closer to 40. And Stützle scored 24. They want him to get over 30 goals. But if I was going to narrow it to one guy, it'd be Dylan Cousins. Dylan Cousins between Buffalo and Ottawa scored 16 goals, and the reason, or the fact that he scored 16 goals is the reason he ended up in Ottawa, and the Sabres were willing to roll the dice on an off-injured Josh Norris, because Josh Norris, when he's healthy, is an offensive driver, and Dylan Cousins, after scoring 31 goals, has scored 18 and 16. A lot of people think he's a more talented offensive player than he's shown, and they need him to score more.
All right, that's a good one, especially, he was one of the bigger moves of the deadline last season, so definitely expect more out of him. Kelsey, looking at this Sens roster, anyone stand out to you as someone who you think really needs to step up?
Well, Cousins was my pick too, and that was a good pick by Mike. I'm also looking at Shane Pinto to maybe up his production from last season, but I'm looking at another deadline acquisition, and that was Zetterlund. And I think they kind of expected a little bit more from him post-deadline. He only had 2 goals, 5 points in those 20 games. I think there's a lot more there for Zetterlund and for him to offer this team. So I'm looking for him to up his production. But Cousins was my pick as well. I mean, it's hard to kind of overlook that one, especially after giving up Josh Norris. So that'll be interesting to see what those two do. But those are the two guys for me, as both the guys they got from the deadline last year, as Zetterlund and Cousins.
All right. Well, I want to wrap things up today talking about one of the, I think, bigger storylines from the playoffs last season, a storyline that potentially may have cost Pete DeBoer his job in Dallas. So we saw, of course, the Dallas Stars go down in the Western Conference Final. Jake Oettinger, of course, was pulled, ended, his season ended very quickly. Pete DeBoer threw him under the bus a little bit to the media afterwards. It became a big storyline. Of course, DeBoer ended up losing his job as head coach afterwards. So, but focusing now on moving forward, Oettinger was asked during camp this week how last season ended for him, with how quickly he was pulled and after allowing only 2 goals on the only 2 shots that he faced in that game 5 of the Western Conference Finals. So he said, quote, "In the long run, I feel like I'm going to look back on it as something that helped me. And when we do win it all, it's going to be, look back and laugh and feel like that was something I had to go through in order to get to that." So, I mean, Mike, do you think that Oettinger feels like he's coming into this season with a chip on his shoulder, like he's got something to prove, even though, DeBoer is gone and it's really kind of universally accepted he's going to be one of the top 2 goalies for the US in the Olympics? I mean, it doesn't really sound like a guy who you would think has a lot to prove, but I mean, do you think that he feels like he does have something to prove after last season ended? I mean, could this be the Jake Oettinger revenge tour?
I think anybody who not only was thrown under the bus, but the bus was driven over him 3 or 4 more times just for, I mean, it was ridiculous the way Pete DeBoer did that. And I mean, he's one of the best goaltenders in the league. He wasn't having a particularly great series, and Edmonton seems to have his number. I see Oettinger sort of as the Josh Allen of the NHL in the sense of, he's lost to Kansas City year after year. Well, Jake Oettinger can't beat Connor McDavid. Join the crowd. A lot of people can't beat Connor McDavid. This guy is one of the best goaltenders in the league. I think he's probably looking at this season as, I have something to prove. Our team is one of the best teams in the league. We've basically got a ticket to the Western Conference Final. Now it's get to that next step and win a Stanley Cup.
Yeah, like you said, everyone, I mean, get in line of people who have a hard time defending Connor McDavid. So, Kelsey, what do you think? Do you think that we see Oettinger potentially even unlock another level this year as he kind of looks to prove himself?
I mean, as Mike said, anytime you're thrown under the bus by your head coach, that does not feel good. And I think there's even more pressure when that head coach gets fired. And it's kind of like it's crunch time. Like, you got to prove that you were right in this situation. And I think that's kind of a fire under him this season. And I do agree with Mike's assessment too about the Edmonton Oilers. I mean, I think this is more about the Edmonton Oilers and just a bad matchup for Jake Oettinger and Connor McDavid than it is about Ottinger's ability as a goaltender. I mean, he has a career .881 save percentage in the playoffs against the Edmonton Oilers in 11 games played. I would venture to guess that a lot of goaltenders' numbers look pretty similar to that in the playoffs against the Edmonton Oilers. So I'm looking for Jake Oettinger to do what he does. I think he's going to have a solid, steady season as he has throughout his career. And hopefully he doesn't run into Edmonton in the playoffs again. But if they do, which seems kind of inevitable to some extent, I think that this might be maybe the year that he gets the best of them, but we'll see. I think at the end of the day, though, there's nothing like proving yourself right in a situation like this. And I think that's a little bit of a fire that's going to be lit under him this year.
I know who's rooting for Mr. McDavid to sign in the Eastern Conference on July 1st, 2026. He's number 1 in line. He's rooting for that.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of the West teams are rooting for that. All right. Well, that is going to be where we end it today on the Wraparound. Of course, still got a lot more to talk about throughout the week. So we will be back right here on Friday to talk about even more news and notes from around the league. So thank you for joining us today and hope you come back and join us again. Thank you, as always, to Sticks.com for sponsoring us as well. For Mike Augello and Kelsey Surmacz, I'm Emma Lingan. This is the Wraparound, and we will see you next time.